Hi, and welcome to the Fund Selectors podcast with me, your host, Lucy Walker. I am a huge supporter of the voice of the fund buyer, and this podcast dives deep into the minds of the biggest and best in our industry. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Shakhista Mukhamedova, Head of Global Manager Research Europe at RBC Brewin Dolphin. This episode is different to the ones that we've had so far on the podcast, in that Shakhista's background started in a different place. Her background started in structured products and moving on to fixed income. And so that different path led us to have quite a different but yet very interesting conversation. Shakhista's fascination for fund research and manager research shines through, and some of the really notable conversations were around areas such as her raising a discussion amongst her colleagues of what are we even about? What is this unit, this manager research unit, even trying to achieve? I found the conversation fascinating and loved to hear many of the book recommendations that she made throughout the podcast, which I'll definitely be checking out. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Hi Shakhista, welcome to the Fund Selectors podcast.
Hi Lucy, thank you for inviting me.
My absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I thought we could start with what enticed you into the world of fund research.
That's a really good question. And actually, I was thinking about our conversation today, what it is that enticed me. And I would say what enticed me is actually the markets, the investments, the role itself, the fund selection. I think if you do this survey amongst every single fund selector in the industry in London or even outside of London, they all will tell you they fell into it. And that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't know what exactly it means, but I knew it's something to do with investments. I knew it's something to do with markets, and it's something to do with research and the analysis. And this is what I wanted to do.
Nice. And I suppose that it sounds like there was something about markets that had always interested you. You know, what was your kind of exposure to markets prior to the point where, you kind of fell into it? Was it something that you kind of grew up knowing about? What was the point when markets kind of you became aware of them?
Yeah, no, I actually grew up not knowing about them very much at all. So I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So I had some kind of peeks into what it may look like. When I went to university, this is when because my degree was really broad. My university was preparing sort of people who would work abroad at embassies or like economic attaché. So you get a really big sort of broad exposure to lots of different subjects. And we did microeconomics, macroeconomics. We did financial engineering, which is kind of unusual, I understand, but we did like a 5-year degree. And this is when I started sort of to realize how interesting that is, because it involves sort of a lot of sort of a human element to it, the behavior, all the market participants, how they behave. It has a very big part of politics, how it influences the markets. And also it had just a very interesting sort of driving force of a lot of innovations, a lot of things that sort of become just an idea and then become something that we use every day, like iPhones, for example. So this is what really interested me, the kind of the broadness, the variety of the whole sort of ecosystem and how it all interacts with each other and how you kind of try to I almost saw it sort of as this massive giant puzzle. So, and kind of my brain is structured the way that when I see a puzzle, I just have to kind of try myself in it. So that's kind of what's attracted me to this industry.
I love that. I love the puzzle. Gonna get you one of those like insane ones where you have like baked beans and you have to try and get them all together, even though every piece looks identical. I imagine that would have you busy for quite a while, or maybe not.
Yes, yeah. Well, hopefully, yeah.
So
Yeah.
so it sounds like your uni degree was really useful and practical. I mean, if I think about certainly in the UK, most degrees are not that useful full, or certainly don't kind of lead into a specific career. So it's really great to hear that yours did. And 5 years, gosh, that's a big commitment, certainly bigger than your average. So yeah, really great that that led you obviously into this path. So let's move then on to fund research. So I guess you've obviously been at RBC Brewin, what was Brewin and is now RBC Brewin for many many years now. Do you want to just give us a sense of your path? You know, where did you begin, and how have you ended up in your current role, heading up the team in Europe?
Yes, of course. So I started my career in 2009. So this is when the investment industry, as you know, was in its knees. In fact, it was an absolutely horizontal condition. So it was on the floor fully. It was really tough to get my first job. And I just kind of wanted to get anywhere, just to sort of to start out and see where I can get on. So my first job was actually with St. James's Place. And I was incredibly lucky because I've joined a partner, a female partner, who was a really interesting woman. And she mostly spent her time sort of on the client side. And my job was to help her sort of with the portfolio construction and doing a lot of things that sort of financial planning is busy with, sort of tax, the various insurances, and only a small part of my job was kind of relating to the portfolio construction. So very quickly, kind of, I understood that this is where my interest is. This is what I'd really like. I'm really interested, and then I started looking for opportunities. And luckily for me, again, sort of Brewin was looking for a junior analyst, and with a focus on structured products. And I was quite good at math, at physics. I enjoyed it at school. So for me, and as I mentioned, we did financial engineering at university. So I already knew the concept. I came in for an interview, and that's kind of where it all began. So I started doing the structured product, derivatives, all this kind of thing. Alongside it, I also had to look at the credit, because all of them are issued by banks. So you have to understand sort of the quality of the credit. And especially that was at a time when financial system as a whole was in quite a lot of distress. And so we had structured products linked to some Irish banks that no longer exist. We had some, like Lehman Brothers had a massive book of structured products. Again, some entity doesn't exist anymore. So it was already clear at that point that it was important not just understand the kind of the option strategy, but also understand the quality of the counterparty you're exposed to. So this is how kind of I started to look into the fixed income. From then on, I moved on to start. I had a short period actually when I looked at the UK equity manager selection alongside another more senior colleague. And at that time, we had an opening on the fixed income as well. So I started working with my other senior colleague on the fixed income manager selection. And when we started doing, when I started attending meetings, I realized that this is the area I'm the most interested in. And this because you get the full variety sort of things you can do, and things you need to learn about, and things you should be curious about. And so that really appealed to me. So it's about sort of the macroeconomy, about monetary policy, about the politics, about sort of different technical features of the fixed income, the key durations, the spread duration, how it all can work, interact. So that was really interesting. And then it just happened so that we had some changes on the team. Analyst who was looking after infrastructure and property left, but we weren't kind of expanding any further. And it wasn't a very large part of our portfolios. And because it kind of has a similar profile to fixed income, so it's a long-term, long duration. You've got that kind of fixed or floating, sort of adjustable payments, and you really need to understand the credit risk of infrastructure project in a slightly different way. So it kind of was natural that someone just picks it up, and I was like, yeah, give it to me. I'll have a look. I'll see what it's all about. So, and it was interesting. It was different. So I started looking into this more and more and more, and started developing it a bit more as well on those two particular ones. And then it kind of progressed again into us thinking maybe we need to start thinking about the kind of developing absolute return and adding more strategies there. And we didn't really have like a dedicated person. We had that function kind of, or research kind of split across like various people. And so for some time I worked alongside with another colleague on this, but getting sort of to know the hedge fund industry. But also throughout this time, as I was with Brewin, I did CFA first, and then I decided to try and do a Kaya. And I actually enjoyed Kaya the most than CFA. CFA I found almost like a memory test. There wasn't anything kind of that made you say, oh, this is interesting, I want to find out more. Whereas when I did Kaya, there was like this whole section of hedge funds. And I was like, oh, okay, this is so different. I want to learn more. What is the global macro? What is the equity dispersion? What is the relative value trading? Um, and that's kind of how I developed into this alternative side as well. But it wasn't that kind of my main focus. And I guess why I stayed so long is typically one of the reasons you move because you don't feel recognized or you don't feel like you're learning anything anymore. And I've been incredibly lucky. As I sort of stayed with the company, I would get promoted, I would get supported. Brewin supported us with a study leave and paying for our CFAs, for Kayas, for anything else I wanted to do. I did credit analysis with Brewin. I did data fellowship course with Brewin. So I never felt like I wasn't getting what I needed sort of to continue to stay.
Well, I mean, that's just a fascinating journey through your career. It's really unusual, actually. I bet when you applied for that structured product role, that you were the most qualified, given that you were, you loved maths, you loved physics, and you'd done financial engineering at university. I can't imagine most junior analysts probably had the level of understanding that you did. And it sounds like it's really set you on a path to do areas of fund research, which I would say are generally less focused on by the industry. I think it generally equities are where most people, myself included, certainly enjoyed or spent most of their time. So it's really, really, yeah, really interesting that you've gone on a totally different path, right? Structured product, which, as you say, interestingly had that kind of credit element. Then you obviously went into, I think you said fixed income, a little bit of equities, but then actually alts. So yeah, I'd really like to kind of dig into those areas, in a moment. But perhaps we could just touch on your obviously the new role that you have taken on now, and kind of how that, I say now, you've obviously taken that on a little while ago now, but how that's been and what you've kind of done as part of that new role.
Yes, so the rule was a kind of what we were supposed to do. We were merging two different teams, but those two different teams worked using sort of the same investment philosophy. So what is investment philosophy? There's quite a few different bits, but the main one has always been is that our job is to find a really good, very consistent manager and to underwrite that manager to the point where we're so confident we can say we can hold and allocate with them for 5-10 years. But the approach sort of how we would do this was slightly different. And that's because it's a different asset classes. So you have to take this into account, sort of take those nuances into account as well. So my first job, sort of putting it all together, has been to firstly to define our playing field, what it is we think we should be doing overall together. So what will be our main overarching sort of goal, and that you cannot do in isolation. I cannot just go away by myself or even go away with just my team and we sit and decide, okay, we're just going to do this one thing and nothing else. You have to do it sort of with the business. You have to bring all the different stakeholders. So we did do that. We actually had a big sit down where we invited people from different parts, our investment managers, portfolio managers, technology team, people from like direct equity research, the strategy, investment solutions. So we have lots of different sort of subsections to our research department, each with the specializations and different bits, but it all comes together sort of to then deliver one single product. So we did review, and sort of out of this came out sort of kind of our main thing, that what we wanted to do. And then after that, then I kind of went away and tried to work out sort of the process itself, what it should look like. And I think what would be.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry. So that big,
Yeah.
massive meeting that you set up, that you organised with all of those different parts of the business, that was still focused on thinking about fund research, albeit you brought lots of other inputs in, or was that a kind of broader discussion? I just wanted to understand. It sounds like it was more from a fund research perspective.
It was specifically manager research.
Manager
Yes,
research. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And it kind of, to really understand sort of how it all went about and why we had to do this, we have to start like almost 14 years ago. And the reason we have to do this is because at the time when I joined, I think that was the time when people were just starting to understand that manager research needs to be brought into the professional sort of level. It needs to be done properly. It needs to be based on some evidence, on some research. And sort of we started sort of developing from there. And it goes back again to why I've kind of been so loyal, why I stayed so long, is because I've been one of those people who were there at the beginning when we were developing our process, when we were sort of developing even our DGQ document, when we were adding more and more and more pieces. And at some point, it was like a massive document with like 50 pages, which recently I had to review and sort of bring it back in. And I can tell you about why we did it. And the reason we kind of had to go through this massive evolution, starting from, and I know it kind of sounds really flippant, but there was a time when funds would recommend it or invest it on because salesperson was a friend with someone else. And they would kind of get together in a pub, spend 2-3 hours and decide, okay, that looks like a good fund, so let's just go for it. But then financial crisis sort of gave, I guess, a bit of a wake-up call to people. Actually, you need to know what you're doing. And if you think about how different pieces of research are undertaken across investment industry, and let's think about equity research. This is kind of the most established. This is so well researched. There's so much material. There's so many courses. You can just sign up online and do Wall Street financial modeling. You can read all those books written by very famous investors that have a long history. So we're all familiar with things like concepts like marginal safety, the economic modes, all kind of, there's a lot of proven academically researched ways on how you approach it, how exactly you would look at the company, what it is exactly you're trying to achieve. Is it a value strategy? Is it a growth strategy? For fund research, there's barely anything. If you Google, there is like, you won't even find a book. I think there is one book actually written by a head of SJP research guy.
Yeah, Joe Wiggins.
It's horrendously expensive, actually. I think it's more expensive than Warren Buffett's book. Yeah. So it's there's so few information. So you're basically building the process from scratch, and you're trying to think what would be kind of the best way of doing it. So it's repeatable, it makes sense, but also it can cater for different strategies. Because to be honest, doing manager selection for 14 years, I still didn't have a case which looked like another case. There are commonalities, but there's always some nuances, and then where you have to adjust your research and sort of narrow in or focus on some specifics that haven't sort of come up before. So this is kind of the background to why we had to do it more recently as well, is to first to decide what it is we're trying to achieve by doing the manager selection. Do we just want to have the best performing fund that just done the best in the last 3 years? Or is it the fund manager who we think will do the best in the next 3 years? And that's a big difference, because you can see in the press stuff that comes out, or someone was dropped from the dog list because their 12 months performance was bad. But actually, from our point of view, we may think if it was a bad performance, maybe that's actually the time we want to invest into that manager now. So it was a bit of a kind of philosophical search, even sort of for the whole point, what it is we're trying to achieve and how we want to achieve it. So, yeah.
Really, really, really fascinating. So really refreshing actually to hear the point about yeah, the kind of the 12-month performance might actually be the right time to enter, and I couldn't agree more. That was, you know, very much sort of my thinking as well when I was back in my my manager research days. What and the point you made about, yeah, going down the pub and then buying a fund afterwards. I mean, yes, that definitely used to happen, and obviously good, very good that that doesn't happen, and actually really interesting that you were part of that kind of journey of professionalization, you know, 14 plus years ago, and then obviously now kind of continuing to do so. So it sounds like this recent big kind of meeting and your thinking afterwards obviously did decide. I think you referenced earlier kind of the next 5 to 10 years ideally. So you're really thinking, you know, in a decent time horizon when coming to invest in funds. How about more kind of under the bonnet? And maybe let's talk about fixed income and alts, given that, you know, most of the discussions that happen on this podcast or that have happened on this podcast have generally been on the equity side. So why don't we, you know, feel free to pick either asset class and just give us a sense of what some of the things are that you deem to be most important when researching those sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there needs to be kind of a main framework for when we start. I won't go sort of through the whole process of sort of
Yeah.
building the universe, deciding what's right, what's not, and then sort of taking all those steps. But I think whenever you approach any new search, there always needs to be sort of a common framework agreed by the whole team. So everyone buys into this framework. Everyone believes this is the thing you're actually looking for. And now there is kind of Morningstar introduced this kind of pillar approach, 4-pillar approach, and I think it's a really good kind of carcass for your sort of any research you can do on a fund. And this is what we have. We added few bits to it, but in the core and main thing, it's still sort of those main sort of 4 Ps. It's performance, philosophy, and process, and and people. Did I do the performance first? Yeah.
You did performance first, yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's not always actually the most important thing, but it's incredibly important because it's the evidence of how all other things work. And on other things as well, maybe I'll sort of pick out some of them to just give you a bit more sort of understanding of how we think about it. One thing I would say, philosophy. A lot of people disregard it. A lot of people think it's not that important. And sometimes you even have managers, and when you tell them, just tell me what's good about your fund, just tell me what sort of puts you apart, they'll just go straight into process. They'll not mention their philosophy. But philosophy is actually really important because it tells you a lot about how they think. And the reason it's important, because philosophy is sort of supposed to define your main sort of this high level global thinking about what is you're trying to sort of use as your edge when you're investing. So we all have some focus, some specialization, and then we have sort of this kind of more broader, generally sort of experience and knowledge. And each manager, if you kind of look in their attribution and their performance into how they tend to allocate, each manager actually has that edge as well. And sometimes they may not realize it themselves, but they would have kind of a preferred way of doing things. And it's quite personal. And the sort of this generally teams-based process approach, I think only exists in a very few fund houses. Majority of the fund managers, from my experience, has been it's always about that person and how they think about why they're investing and doing this particular thing. So if they've got a clear philosophy, it means they clearly understand why they're able to deliver this outperformance. So it becomes less about the luck. It becomes a proper skill. It's something you learn over time. You make mistake, you sort of take something out of it, and then you know you can repeat it again because you've develop this belief over your career that if I do this specific thing, when I specifically focus on the cash flows just for the next 12 months and sort of project them, and then I think about the specific points of the macro data, can it be labor or inflation, and sort of try to incorporate it or something else, it's kind of, they've got a feel for, usually people just get a feel for why they're doing something right, and then they understand why they're doing it right consciously. So it's a very kind of a big I don't know, maybe deviation from what we are, but it's a big and important sort of thing to understand what it is they're trying to do. And there are some very interesting sort of pillars of philosophy you come across with the various fund managers, and you notice like some of them, they understand and appreciate the value of behavioral science, the understanding how it affects the markets. Some of them are just specifically focusing on specific like mispricing anomalies, and this is what they're looking for. They dedicate majority of their time to this. And some of them think their edge kind of in doing this extra research or doing it in a slightly different way. So that gives you the kind of the main thinking about how they approach their fund and why they're doing it. And then the next thing I wanted to pick up on is a people. And again, this is people, because it's just so varied and it's so interesting. And why it's also so interesting is because I think as an industry, we've been lucky that the last probably, I don't know, 7-8 years, there's been so much literature coming out, so much research on behavioral science, on biology of thinking. There's even been a really interesting book, and I can't remember the name of it. It's about someone who was a trader, a currency trader, I believe, a commodities trader. And then he analyzed sort of, and then he decided to switch his career and became neuroscientist. And he decided sort of to analyze why some traders are so good and some are not. And he found there's a lot sort of to do with the biology as well. Sort of, it's just our physical way of how we exist, the chemistry. And when you think about this, it actually makes a lot of sense, because when you discuss things with fund managers, and you probably have seen it yourself, Lucy, when you're on an investor lunch and there's like 10, 15 analysts and the fund manager is trying to do their update or presentation, there always will be one analyst who will ask it kind of in the most aggressive way, their question. And the fund manager, like if you just think about it as people, if I aggressively ask someone something, or if someone asks me that, what I will do, I will immediately become very defensive. I will immediately raise my guard and start thinking very carefully about what I respond to you. So I will filter my information as much as possible, not to give you anything that may kind of deviate. So this like bits and pieces like this are quite interesting when you think about the people themselves. So with our team, we even develop sort of this matrix where we think about when we meet the fund manager and we start to think about sort of how intellectually curious they are, how confident they are. Do they have the kind of this, I wouldn't say we use a fund manager name for it, but we call it sort of a syndrome. And this syndrome is when the fund manager is just become so powerful, so successful that anyone on his team scared to challenge them. So we think about those pieces and sort of put and rate them just to give us sort of an idea. So this is kind of the things that we look at, and we'll do it with any manager actually, not just fixed income. But this is kind of things we would, maybe it makes us different. Yeah.
Thank you. Really interesting and useful, I'm sure, to many listening. I mean, on philosophy, gosh, if people don't understand their edge, they don't have an edge, right? Or at least they don't have a repeatable edge. And that's the key. So yeah, that is completely agree. Just so important. And your point about people reminded me of the book we had, Ryan Hughes from AJ Bell on in a previous episode, and he talked about his book recommendation was I wish I could remember the name. I'm pretty sure it had fox in it. I'll have to check the name
The foxes and hedgehogs.
Was it hedgehogs? It's the one about basically chemical reaction. So we all think that we're going about our lives and we've got control over our lives, but actually how much of our life and decisions is actually, to your point about biology, actually just based off the chemical reactions that are going on inside our body. And it just, yeah, was absolutely fascinating. So that really sort of chimed for me with what you were saying back there. Have you read the book? Is it the one you mentioned? I feel like it
I've,
had a bit of
I've
me.
read a different one. I've read about the way sort of we make decisions, and it was in the context of because of forecasting, because obviously we have to do a lot of forecasting as a part of our job, and the kind of that they proposed a theory. I wish I prepared better and sort of written down the names of different books. I didn't expect to kind of discuss them in some details, but this one in particular was effectively saying that a group of people who are very confident, they can build and articulate their case very strongly. These are, I believe, hedgehogs. And then there are people who are less confident, who always say, well, if this happens, then this happens, and this happens, then that happens, and then I have to readjust my forecast. So these are for the foxes, sort of the more flexible ones. And people who are actually less confident in their forecast turn out to be better forecasters
Interesting.
because they kind of constantly adjust and incorporate new information into their thinking.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Gosh, there's so many avenues that we could go down. You talked about the matrix. Well, not the matrix, but your matrix when it comes to people and the different qualities. I'd be really interested to hear. Obviously, you were alluding to maybe a famous manager who shall remain nameless, but have there been scenarios, and again, obviously nameless, but have there been scenarios where you've done your matrix, you filled it out, and as a team or as an individual, you've gone, okay, this is a red flag. We're not going to invest. Would just be really interested to hear that kind of live in the process, whether that's had an impact.
We had a situation like this. Um, so everything was stacking up really well. And I'm not gonna, yeah, so this is quite interesting because this particular manager, we actually came back to them after several years. So what was the sort of the original situation? The original situation was the people bit was absolutely perfect. So we ticked all the boxes. It was experienced team, very stable. They've been together for a long time. They could explain and understand their portfolio. They could explain that why they've made those trades, not the others. And it all seemed kind of working quite well. Their process also was very clear, articulated, and you could see the results. Sort of, you could see as you discuss sort of the trades, you could see that actually that process is being used. It's not just a marketing thing they've put on a slide. This is exactly how it works. And the process, again, sort of ticked all the boxes and we approved it and it seemed really good. Then we moved to sort of the philosophy. The philosophy was also very stable, very clear. They understood exactly why they're doing what they're doing. And they knew exactly sort of what it is they need to do in order to continue sort of delivering good performance. And then there was the final piece is the performance, is the one I was kind of alluding to, that it's quite a big important part, but not necessarily in the way some people use it. It's not just about sort of constant outperformance. And this is where we really hit sort of the wall because the team performed really well on all different parameters that we would look at. They had everything in place. But one thing that was just not happening, there was no consistency in the performance. And it actually was quite a difficult area as well of the market and a specific style, the flavor, which kind of goes in and out of favor. It's very cyclical. So you cannot always expect them to perform in a specific way, but you expect them kind of to keep with the cycle. So there will be periods when there will be just the worst performing fund in your portfolio, and that could last years. And then there will be periods and you won't have time to reposition yourself. So you need to sort of maintain this little bit of it when they should really start performing really strongly. And I guess you will be able to tell now, sort of from the way I'm describing this style, what that was. because for the 10 years of performance we were analyzing, they just had the tiniest periods where they could sort of demonstrate how their process, their philosophy works in practice. And so at that time, when that was put together and proposed to the team, it didn't go through. It failed because it didn't have the final piece. It didn't have the evidence. There was just too little sort of evidence to demonstrate that actually that can work really well. And then when we had this big rotation in styles, we sort of revisited the manager. And that's when we kind of saw that now all of those pieces that we thought put together really well, that should work really well, actually work amazingly well when you hit the right environment. But because at the time we couldn't evidence it, and for us it's a big thing, we have to evidence each piece before we kind of make our decision. So that was kind of one of those examples where you just don't get one piece and maybe you're not making the right decision because you're missing it, or maybe it is the right decision, because there were also cases when we would be able to kind of tick the box on every single thing. And that when I was talking about that nuances about different asset classes, so this is a different asset class, and there we had team that was kind of between amber and green. It's quite good, but there were some missing pieces of information. Then there was philosophy and process that seemed just impeccable, just made sense. It's good, it should work, you would think. And then the final piece was the portfolio. And portfolio seemed really strong. And we kind of went and reviewed each piece in separate. And this is kind of a different thing. It's not like where you have 50 stocks and each company is listed and you can sort of get information easily. That's a bit more kind of sitting on the edge of a private markets where you can sort of have to do a bit different way of researching the assets. And so looking at the portfolio, it all kind of made sense. It all looked good, high quality, plays into all the trends that we're currently discussing, the AI, digitization, the sort of transition to renewables, all these kind of things. But there was a piece kind of that wasn't quite kind of making sense, and that was sort of relating to the team. And that's when kind of, even though we can hit most of the pieces, we're just like not quite hitting one of them fully. So this is when we kind of have to give up after sort of doing so much.
After a lot, a lot
so
of
much work. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, which is can be quite gutting. So remind us how big the team is that you've got across all the asset classes.
So the overall research team is almost 30 people. And we are split out in kind of areas of specialization. So we've got our strategy team. So this is our sort of global thinkers. This is our head of asset allocation, global strategies, head of markets. And then next to them, we've got the investment solutions team. So this is our portfolio managers. So they do all the portfolio rebalancing, implementation, they put things together, they'll check correlations and stuff like this. And this is where we also manage our funds internally. And then we've got the asset selectors. So we've got the manager selection team and we've got the direct equity. And even though we're kind of all split into those subgroups, in reality, the way we work, it's kind of all together. So we all get together to decide how we put things in. So as a fund selectors, we don't just maintain approved list of managers and kind of that's it. Our kind of responsibility stopped here. We gave you the list and now you decide what to do with it. No, because we recognize as a manager selector, you collect so much information on the way about sort of the flavors of the managers, about how they may have certain preferences. Are they typically run the structural overweight to financials? They typically avoid banks, or they typically do this or that or the other. So you know, if you blend them together with that manager, that will work really well. So we don't want to sort of lose this piece of information. And that's why we also sit sort of with our portfolio management team and we sort of we put together those models where we think this is how you best blend all those different flavors and style. And so it's kind of, it's a proper collaborative work. It's not just on the paper that we say this is how we do it. It's kind of, it requires sort of the conversation, openness, and trust between kind of all of us. And because people like, for example, Guy, who's the head of our strategy, David Hood, who's the head of our investment solutions, they've been on the team 14 years ago when I joined. So I've known these people for 14 years. I've spent like 45 hours a week with them. So we really know and trust each other. And that kind of means that we're kind of able to bring all our teams together and sort of try to get the most out of it as possible.
Yeah, that's great. The collaborative nature sounds really really beneficial. So I wanted to come back to the kind of questionnaire that you send managers. So I think you said it was 50 pages, kind of at one point as things were getting added to it, and then you said you'd had a bit of a you'd work to condense it. So was interested to just understand a little bit more about that. I think there's so much value in obviously there's value in detail, but there's also value in being succinct and getting, the key points. And so I'm interested in that kind of journey and what you decided to prioritize. And presumably it's asset class specific as well, at least from a kind of top level perspective.
Yes, yeah. So on that journey, sort of making the manager selection is much more professional. What we started doing, so the way our process works, so we put together a proposal, a DD document, which summarizes the main points on the fund, and we submit it to the team. And then team is expected to challenge it. So they read the whole piece and then try to find holes in it. So the idea is to try and break it. And if you can't break it, if it all stacks up, that's a good thing. We go to the next sort of stage of approval. And during this process, when you do this, and when you have people who are long only equity specialists, you have fixed income specialists, you've got alternative specialists. So you've got people who look at the same thing, but from a very different angle. The way long only person looks at Tesla would be very different the way, for example, I as a fixed income person would look at. For me, for a long time, that was a high yield junk. It's not interesting. Or like, so for equity, it's really exciting. It's high growth. It's got really good sort of, it's also good, sort of serves to the transition. For the long short person, it's, oh, is it overbought? Is it kind of too much excitement going on around the stock? Is it hitting its kind of levels that are completely sort of unjustified? Maybe I should be considering to short it or create a relative value trade. And then you look at kind of all these quantity things, how they position in a specific stock, and gives you another view on the same company. So that's kind of just a very small example on how you can look at the same thing and have a completely different view or opinion or have questions. And so that was the same with our fund. So whenever we would submit a fund, various people from the team will ask different questions. And there was, if we couldn't respond to these questions straight away, we would just add them as a next thing to make sure next time we look at the fund, we cover it off. And we would add those sort of various bits and pieces. And then also as we grew, as our asset under management started growing, as our portfolio managers started to appreciate the work we do and say, oh, okay, you've researched it, we've approved it, we will actually allocate to your fund. So that also meant that we would sort of attract much more assets in our approved funds. And so then we started to have to think about also additional pieces. So we had situations when we would accumulate, it's a really good manager, we would hold them for like, I don't know, 5-6 years, would accumulate massive amount of assets. And then our view changes and then we cannot exit because it's just too much. We can't sell it just one day because if it's anything about 100 million, you can't just sort of turn around, press the button. You have to work through it. So then we started thinking, okay, we need to be prepared for things like this. We have to think in advance. When we recommend things today, we need to know what we will do and why we will do it in the future, what needs to happen and how we would exit. So we would add more additional pieces because just the way our business run has changed. And so we would start adding additional things on liquidity, capacity, how we sort of understand it, how we analyze it. That also kind of evolved with the amount of like software and data that became available to us. So like now, for example, when you look at the fixed income portfolio, you can just drop the whole thing into a spreadsheet, link it to Bloomberg, and pull out all the liquidity scores for each bond, which again is a bit of a theoretical concept, but it gives you kind of the idea. Or you can get sort of the, how big is this bond? How much they're holding of it? Can they build up even more exposure to this bond, or can they exit from this bond? So as more information becomes available, you think, oh, okay, I need to maybe add this and make it my standard, and then add this and add this. And you basically can continue adding new pieces of data absolutely sort of without any limitation, especially today when you can collect so much stuff. So the point I think we came to when we had to think, okay, I think now we've literally covered the thing from every possible angle. Now we have to think, what is actually the most important? What are the most sort of thinnest, breaking, weakest links that we need to be aware of? And what are things that we kind of good to know, but not necessarily we have to kind of spend a lot of time trying to prove or understand or evidence, and identify sort of this main kind of top things, very important, what things we think we need to have in place, and say, okay, we evidenced people, we evidenced process. And then what are the kind of critical small details of information that are important for us? Because we need to think about how we invest in the future. Maybe we want to resize our holding, maybe we want to switch into something else in some point, or maybe we want to kind of blend this fund with another one. So that's kind of how we've gone from this massive document where we'll try to cover off literally everything. Sometimes we'll get bits of information like that this fund manager wakes up at 3 a.m. It's just kind of, just trying to sort of get to really know what this person is like. Can we trust him effectively, to the point of like, no, this is you've got this much space on a page and you just have to distill it to the most important things.
Distill is such a good word for it. Yeah, that's exactly it. Love that. Fascinating. So just how many funds do you, I know obviously you said it's more than the recommended list because it's then thinking about the blending, but if we look at your recommended list, how many funds are on that?
So at the moment it's 150.
Okay,
nice. And it was much larger list.
I was going to say, has that come down, I assume?
Yes, yeah. And that came down because now we have a clear philosophy ourselves. As I was saying, that when we did last year this kind of big thinking exercise, where we're trying to understand what is the purpose of our team, what is our mission, what it is we want to do. And we decided that we want to have the highest conviction picks on our research list that still allow a lot of flexibility about how you put things together, and having some tactical ideas, and not having things where you're not quite sure, but don't have anything sort of particularly really horrible happen to it, sort of to justify removing it completely. But when you make it very clear sort of to yourself, but also to the people you work with, to the business who kind of looks at you and for ideas, if you just say, look, we just want to give you literally our best ideas in the most direct sense of it. We don't want to try to spread our time across other things that may have been interesting at some point, but no longer, but we kind of never can find the time to maintain them, for example, or we don't feel like there's anything particularly horrible to sort of to request that you immediately sell them. So this kind of agreement with the people who you're effectively servicing, your portfolio managers, and this understanding for the team itself that this is what our mission is, makes it easier for us then to sort of narrow it down to make it really focused.
It's such a great exercise that you went through. You know, since starting my business 4+ years ago, the value of, or actually, even to be honest, when I was in my role, actually, just the benefit of stepping away and thinking big picture and actually just aligning around those, you know, as you say, what do we believe in? And the other thing that struck me was that, you know, I think you and I briefly touched on this when we first talked about the podcast, that you know it generally in the market there is a much higher perception of equity, primarily equity research, than there has generally been of fund research. And you know, as you and I discussed last time, actually that's such a misguided view, because you know there is huge complexity. Obviously you can do it in a very simple way, as we said back in the day, you know, maybe it was a glass of red and then there was a trade, but you know, but actually if you want to do it properly, there's a huge amount of really detailed research, much of which you've touched on today, and previous guests have as well. And so the other thing that struck me was that in doing that exercise, in bringing everybody together from all these different parts of the business, as you say, some that you're collaborating with, you know, your equity colleagues, as in your direct analyst colleagues, and then, as you say, effectively your client, your internal colleagues, and you know, bringing them all together and aligning. I just think not only did that, I'm sure, have a hugely beneficial impact in terms of your focus and your alignment, but I suspect also it garnered you a lot, I would say, of respect of the wider business to actually recognize what it is that your unit is there to do. And actually, by saying we're not going to do all this extra stuff that we might have done previously, we're just going to focus on best in class. You know, obviously that, I can't imagine anybody that would say that that's a bad idea. So, you know, that just struck me as a really positive exercise that you took, you and the team and the firm on.
Thank you. Thanks.
My pleasure. Well, on that moment, let's move on to the questions, because but unbelievably that's whizzed by. So the first question, we've kind of already talked about books a little bit. So the first question is a book. Maybe it's one you've already mentioned, or maybe not. But a book that has had the biggest impact on you in your career.
Mhm. Yes, no, this is something I had to think really hard, because I could not sort of filter it down to a single book. I really tried. There is one book I thought I will kind of flag up, because it was probably the first book that then sort of took me on this journey of constantly searching for that next book that will give me something interesting and new and learn about. And I would say all those books, the books like Super Forecasting, the books like Thinking Fast and Slow, they Behave, all these kind of things, they all influenced a lot on the way I think. And I try sort of, whenever I see a new and interesting way of thinking about something, I try to try it and see if it actually works in practice and try to improve it. But one book that really kind of opened that whole world of all this sort of Daniel Kahneman style of looking at your life, at your work, at your analysis was Blink. It was Malcolm Gladwell. And I've read that years ago, and it actually made me to dig out the book again. So I'm rereading it. And it's a book about, and that's a really kind of interesting, and that kind of will relate to the next question that you've got for me that we've discussed at the beginning, when you said there's the two questions that you always end your podcast with. And that relates to it a lot, actually, because it's about, I think a lot of us, to be fund analyst, you need to be not just technical, because you need to understand things like structuring your duration, understand things like structuring your risk exposures. What is the style? How sort of persistent it is, where it's coming from, what different bits contribute to your tracking errors. You know, you've got all these technical things, the batting average, the Sharpe ratio. You need to know what that is. You need to understand how to interpret all of this. But also you have to be more creative, because you will come up with different ways where you have to decide how important this quirk, this behavioral quirk of this fund manager to the whole process philosophy and the fund strategy overall. Is it too much key risk? Or is it the key risk I'm comfortable with? I want to have it. So you always have to be creative about how you solve that problem. And the Blink is kind of about this to some degree. So you have this very analytical, very structured side to yourself. And again, sort of it's about system 1 and 2, this thinking slow and fast. And then we have this kind of innate feeling that something is not right or something is right, even though you've got zero evidence yet. You haven't looked at any data at all. You haven't even asked you don't even know what the question is you're trying to answer, but you already have this feeling. So that's the kind of book about all those things. And he touches on biology as well, about how we react and what the way we think, how it's determined by our biology. And there's an interesting thought, but I think that came actually from another book, it's Other Minds, is that if you were an octopus and you were trying to do the same job, you will not do it the same way, because just the way your sensory whole kind of experience is just so different. Even if you have the same kind of cognitive ability as a human, that's what I mean, not if you're literally an octopus, but I mean, your sensory experience will be so different. And this is something we can't even imagine, because we are just defined by our physical construction. So this is the book. Yeah, sorry, I've taken forever.
No, but that was great. Do you know what that got me thinking about was I was reading something recently that talked about AI and how we are so bounded by our human existence that we can't actually comprehend the capability even today of AI. Even those that are using it, quite like I use it pretty actively, but I know I'm sort of still using it in a human construct. And it actually got me thinking, when you said about an octopus, it just jumped into my head. Maybe that's what we need to do. We need to think as though we're an octopus, and then that might help us think about how we can use AI. If we've suddenly got 8 hands instead of 2, where, I don't know. But yeah, just that was a funny sort of sidebar that made me think of that. But really, what the more we talk, the more I know that there's just so much depth to the way that you think, and I suspect this podcast has only scratched the surface. And your keen love of reading is obviously a real contributor to the way that you wish to continue iterating and improving, and that's something that's always to be commended. So yeah, thank you for the book recommendation. I'm sure that will be much appreciated by many. Although, as you say, we've talked about even more than just the one, so that's some bonus books. So yeah, the next question, which as you said, I told you at the beginning to give you just a little heads up. So the last guest we had on was Matt Pirro, Global Head of Oversight and Manager Search at Vanguard. And his question for you was, what is a mistake that you have made in fund research? How did you establish that it was indeed a mistake, and how did you work through it? Which, on reflection, is probably 3 questions, but we'll let Matt have it. So perhaps you can give us an answer on that one.
Yes, so a mistake I've made was very much related to the book I was discussing. So that was when researching one manager, and as I was saying, like going through the whole process, sort of filling out our matrix of all the things we need to meet, the quality of the team, the quality of the philosophy, the thinking, the quality of the process. It was all looking good. There was one thing that I didn't feel like I really understood how it works. I didn't feel like I really kind of grasped it. But from as analysts, when we bring our proposal to the investment committees or whoever it is that the different firms kind of approves, reviews the research, you always have to argue why this is the best fund or why you don't want to recommend this fund versus the other. And in this particular case, we had quite a lot of interest, a lot of demand for this kind of type of strategy. And there was nothing kind of concrete or tangible I could show to say why I wasn't quite happy with this strategy. So it was really just the feeling that something is not quite right and nothing else. There was like literally no tangible evidence to show, because I could tick the boxes and it's all simply fine. And actually what I've learned is sometimes this feeling is a good enough reason not to invest. And you don't need to justify or do additional work. sometimes it just because you already know that something is not right, and it may come later. And it did come later. It did sort of unravel, and we didn't invest. We were quite happy we didn't. But at the time, there was nothing I could say. This is the kind of the tangible piece of information I can tell you right now that makes me not confident about this particular strategy. So
So,
that's the
so you didn't invest those. So
no.
the mistake then was that you felt as though you needed to have a a piece of evidence to back up this gut feeling that you had. And actually,
Yes.
on reflection, you realized that, to your point, the gut feeling sometimes is enough. Certainly, I always say gut feeling shouldn't be a reason why you buy a fund, but it can always be a reason why you don't buy a fund.
Yes, yeah. Actually, that's not really a proper mistake, is it? It's kind of one thing that I felt sort of,
It feels
yeah,
like a mistake somebody would give in an interview when they're giving an
exactly.
answer
Yeah,
that's
no,
not
no,
quite
it's
an
not a
answer.
genuine. I mean, a genuine mistake. Okay, there was another one, not another one, but actual real mistake, not the interview style mistake. So that mistake was relating to, um, so we had a manager already approved. So one of my colleagues worked on due diligence for it. Um, but it was one of my kind of analysts. So my job was to make sure he hasn't missed anything, everything is done properly. Um, so it is my mistake. It's not the other person's. And then we had update with that particular manager, and they brought in sort of various figures and numbers to show us how they've done, what went well, what didn't go well. And there was one particular piece uh, that kind of suggested, sort of contradicted completely to what they were saying. It could have been interpreted both ways. And by default, because it's kind of a thing that I've seen before, sometimes it can have kind of a different ways of interpretation. And because I've been doing this job for such a long time, my default position was, okay, I don't need to clarify this. That's basically what usually sort of, that's the basic explanation that normally is the explanation for this particular discrepancy. And I did not clarify it at that time. I kind of asked about it, but didn't dig into it. And I knew that I didn't. And I knew that I didn't only after some time sort of has passed. You know, sometimes you meet the manager, you discuss one thing and something kind of clicks, but you don't kind of really spend too much time on it. And you kind of default to your, okay, normally from my experience, I know this is how, where this is coming from. But then it turned out it doesn't come from that particular thing that I should have clarified. And because it started performing in a way that I did not expect, this is how I knew I've made a mistake. And this is when I started looking into it, into more detail. And what I've learned is, I think the biggest takeaway from this mistake was, however experienced you are, you always need to have a younger person with you in that meeting who've never maybe looked or seen it before, because for them, this will be quite natural to say, oh, Shakhista, actually, this was like, what's the explanation for this? Why do you think that was okay or not okay? Because that, it sort of pushes you out of your way that you worked out over the years, sort of, okay, this works that way, this works this way. You sort of, you create this path in your brain. This is how it's all connected, and this is supposed to lead to this. And sometimes you need someone kind of to take you out of this and sort of look at it again with fresh eyes. And so that's kind of my biggest takeaway. Yeah.
That's great. I think that definitely ticks the box. So yeah, no, that's so important, isn't it? It's funny sometimes, the sort of simplest almost of questions, or what might be perceived as a simple question, or an obvious, or would have an obvious answer, actually doesn't mean that not confirming that isn't still important. So yeah, that's a really good lesson for us all, not just in fund research, but actually more generally, I would say. Amazing. So the final job for you today is to set a question for our next guest, who you don't know who it is yet, but what question would you like them to answer?
Yeah, so I thought my question, because we kind of spent so much time talking about behavioral science, I thought my question would be, what is the sort of your personal behavioral bias that you've identified you had and tried to overcome or working on overcoming?
Nice. And maybe rather than which, but probably the biggest, right? Because we all have
Yeah.
so many. But yeah,
Well,
no,
sometimes you have to start with smallest ones to
that's true.
work your way up to the biggest one.
I like that. I like that. So yeah, which one are you? Yeah, if you identified and you're working on. Okay, great. Really, really nice. Fantastic. Well, Shakhista, thank you so much. This has been such a enlightening conversation, and one that I know we could have dug in much deeper into lots of areas. So that no doubt will have to be a part two at some point. But thank you for being a guest on Fund Selectors.
Thank you, Lucy. No, it was great to speak, and I'm very happy to come back.
Great. Thanks again.